history.
Strangling 93
Her
women.
body was found last Wednesday morning, dismembered and burned.
Raped, tortured, and murdered 33 young men and boys.
An epidemic of serial killers.
Federal law enforcement officials believe there are likely 100 serial killers out there at any time.
Viewer discretion is advised.
Japan, 1989. If you lived in Japan during this time, you were lucky enough to be in the height of its economic bubble. A bubble most never thought of popping, or even imagined it could. The economy was booming. Japanese companies like Toyota and Sony were becoming world-renowned, and Japanese businessmen, pockets fat with cash, can now afford to buy things never before possible. Pebble Beach Golf Course, New York City's Rockefeller Center, and Hollywood's iconic Columbia Pictures were just a few of the properties they snatched up. The Japanese stock market was thriving, and a strengthened yen kept interest rates low and property values up. The anime boom period was on the horizon and about to gain global popularity, and the sounds of city pop were everywhere. 1989 also ushered in the end of the Showa period and the beginning of the Heisei period, when one emperor dies and another takes the throne. Heisei translates to peace everywhere. Ironically, for one girl, that wasn't to be. Lurking out there in an idyllic Japan were four boys who were set on destruction and devastation. Through a combination of a difficult home life, trouble in school, bad temperament, or troubles in the community, these four were developing to be the worst of the worst Japan had to offer. Hiroshi Miyano was born April 30th, 1970, the first son in his family. He would begin a roller coaster ride of criminal activity early, alternating between periods of stability and destruction. Both of his parents worked to keep the family going, so while they were well off financially, there wasn't necessarily harmony in the home. Hiroshi began his criminal path by getting into trouble in primary school through various acts of stealing, bullying, and vandalism. He then moved on to becoming violent with his family. Not knowing what else to do to curb their son's attitude, Hiroshi's father went to the school for advice. Apparently, whatever he was told helped Hiroshi to keep it together for a while. Throughout his middle school years, Hiroshi became interested in judo and concentrated on it while mostly staying out of trouble. However, judo was harder in high school and he was bullied by seniors. Hiroshi wouldn't put up with this for long, because a mere half a year later he left judo before leaving school entirely another half year after that. From here he worked as a tiler, but joined a motorcycle gang around this time. He once again picked up his criminal path and received probation for offenses causing bodily injury, breaking and entering, and theft. It's unknown if probation helped curb his criminal appetite to some degree, but it was at this time he settled down for another year or so. Hiroshi began working hard and left the motorcycle gang. He moved in with his friend, Yasushi Watanabe's older sister, and desired to marry her. He began saving money for this marriage, but became dissatisfied with his low wages and quit showing up for work. From here it began to go back downhill again when a former classmate introduced Hiroshi to a Yakuza member who taught him how to sell fake brand goods, working as a takiya, which were basically Japanese peddlers, and looking after Yakuza offices. It was also around this time that Hiroshi began inhaling paint thinner. Jo Ogura was born May 1971. His parents separated when he was young, and Jo was raised by his mother and sister. From early on, it was clear Jo was good at sports, and he showed an inclination toward them. He seemed to latch onto them and to stay out of trouble so he could play them at school until a skiing accident in January 1986 would change all of that. Jo would receive a complex fracture in his right foot and be unable to continue in sports. He would become lazy with schoolwork due to this and be expelled from high school in November 1987. From here, Jo started working as an apprentice electrician and enrolled in night school. However, he quickly lost interest in his education yet again and quit going. From May 1988, he seems to be stagnant, not doing much of anything productive. In July 1988, he was caught driving a motorcycle without a license and put on probation. Nobuharu Minato was born December 1972. He grew up with an older brother and two parents in the home. Both of his parents were in the medical field and worked for the same hospital, his father as a pharmacist and his mother as a nurse. Due to this, it appears they weren't around much. Acting out early, Nobuharu began causing trouble in primary school with threatening behavior and shoplifting. In middle school, his verbal and physical violence intensified greatly, and he began rebelling against his father. His behavior would worsen still, with Nobuharu refusing to go to school or come home at night, keeping bad company, becoming more violent at home, then quitting school completely in September 1988. In the summer of 1988, defying their father and having whoever they wanted over whenever they felt like it, it was in the Minato brothers' bedrooms that a hangout for hoodlums would find its safe haven. Their parents were at work most of the time, and eventually, the brothers wouldn't even allow their parents into their rooms. Knowing of their son's involvement with the Yakuza, and fearful of his growing violence towards them, his parents were afraid to disobey their son. Nobuharu was also caught driving a motorcycle without a license around this time and put on probation. Hey guys, post-production Jill here. There was something that I noticed in the editing just now that I wanted to come in and make a little comment on. The picture that everybody has up around the internet of Yasushi Watanabe, I think that is actually a mislabeled picture. I was watching a Japanese documentary on Junko's case, and it's, Japanese spoken, and all of the captions and whatnot are in Japanese. And obviously I can't speak or write Japanese, but it seems that they would know better than what we would, anybody translating it or having American interest in the case. They would know better who is who than we would. So I honestly believe that right now on your screen, the top picture is actually Yasushi Watanabe, and the bottom picture that everybody has labeled as Yasushi to actually be Nobuharu Minato's older brother. He was been mentioned, throughout the case, everywhere that you read about it, and he was never named, though. But I honestly think that is who those pictures actually belong to. So for the sake of this episode, that's how I'm going to approach this. I'll throw them in, the pictures in where necessary. Okay, guys, thanks. Yasushi Watanabe was born in December of 1971 to two loving parents and a big sister. Unfortunately, by the time Yasushi was 4, his parents could no longer get along and they separated, divorcing when he was 6. Soon after this, his father was killed in a car accident. He was raised by his mom and sister from then on out. There isn't much information on his life growing up after the loss of his father, until in April of 1986, Yasushi enrolled in night school but quit going a week later and dropped out in September. In October 1986, he was put on probation for domestic violence. June 1987 and March 1988 would again see him with minor criminal offenses. It seems he tried a few jobs, but none lasted long with him. It was also Yasushi's big sister that was in a relationship with Hiroshi Miyano. All 4 boys went to the same middle high school. Hiroshi was the oldest, being 18 at the time of the offenses, with Jo Ogura and Yasushi being 17 and in the grade below, and Nobuharu 16, another grade below them. In the summer of 1988, Jo Ogura would begin hanging out with Nobuharu's older brother, who was in the same grade. In October of the same year, the brother's motorcycle had been stolen, and Hiroshi Miyano also began hanging out at the brother's house to help him search for and find it. It was here that a small gang of violent teens formed with Hiroshi as the leader, being feared by the others, and Jo second in command in Hiroshi's absence. 4 individually violent teens, all with their own criminal histories under one roof. The level of violence and youthful beliefs of invincibility would quickly escalate amongst the 4 brutes. It wasn't long before robbing and raping young women was on the agenda for these boys. They would later be arrested for a robbery and rape that took place November 8, 1988. About 2 weeks after this, on November 25th, is when they would cross paths with Junko Furuta. Junko Furuta was from an area known as Misato, Saitama Prefecture, a pretty 17-year-old girl who was making plans for her life beyond high school, a life she would never get a chance to live. By all accounts, Junko Furuta has been described as a sweet, kind-hearted girl. She was popular with many friends. She reportedly had high grades and rare absences. Junko was mature for her age, even holding a part-time job a couple of days a week after school at a plastic moldings factory, intending to save money for a graduation trip. In fact, she had already secured employment after graduation at an electronics retailer. Junko lived at home with her parents, an older brother, and a younger brother. Other than that, no other information has ever really been reported on her family or her home life. From the outside, it would appear Junko was a smart, attractive, independent, and mindful young woman who had her life together more than most at her age. On November 25, 1988, Junko was said to be looking forward to watching the finale of her favorite TV show, Tonbo, when she got home from work. However, it would be on this day the life Junko knew would be forever altered. Here is also where there are a few differing opinions. I've read an account of Hiroshi being attracted to Junko, asking her out and her refusing him. This caused him to be furious with her, thinking himself above most. If this account is true, Junko didn't seem to be afraid of him and wouldn't be bullied into dating him. There is another account that stated Junko and her friends weren't liked by Hiroshi's gang because they took school so seriously and didn't smoke, drink, or do drugs. This could be another reason for the attack on her. Whatever the reason for the events, they all had went to school together and may have had some knowledge of each other's existence, if nothing else. Regardless of the backstory, their paths crossed on the night of November 25, 1988. Hiroshi and Nobuharu were out on mopeds in Misato looking for a young woman to rape and rob when they came across Junko, just getting off work and heading home on a bicycle. Hiroshi told Nobuharu to kick that woman. Nobuharu did as he was told, causing Junko to wreck her bike and fall, while Nobuharu took off. Hiroshi pretended to be happening by and stopped to comfort Junko and offer her help. Quote, "That one's crazy. I've been threatened by him with a knife a short time ago. You may still be in danger. Let me walk you home," Hiroshi reportedly said to Junko. An upset Junko agreed. Hiroshi lured her to a warehouse where he then revealed he and Nobuharu were Yakuza and threatened Junko by telling her she would die if she didn't allow him to have sex with her without her screaming. If she obeyed, she could live. Hiroshi raped her and then took her by taxi to a hotel and raped her again. He then called their hangout at Nobuharu's house and bragged about having Junko. Jo Ogura asked him to keep her as they all wanted to meet up with her. Hiroshi complied, and around 12:30 a.m., the four met with Junko in the park. Hiroshi and Jo decided at this time to imprison Junko, telling her they knew where she lived and they would have Yakuza kill her whole family if she tried to escape. They had learned her address through a notebook in her backpack, one which all students were required to carry. Junko was easily overpowered and taken to Nobuharu's house in the Ayazi district of Adachi, where she was repeatedly gang-raped. On November 27th, Junko's parents were distraught and beside themselves with fear of where their daughter was and why she hadn't returned home. They contacted police and asked them to search for her. It was around this time that Hiroshi's gang would force Junko to call her parents and tell them she had run away but she was safe and staying with friends. She was forced to tell her parents she wanted police to stop searching for her. Through to the middle of December, the gang would force Junko to place 2 more calls like this to her parents. Having heard of these calls, police then considered Junko a runaway even though her parents begged them to keep searching and knew in their hearts this wasn't what had truly happened to their daughter. As for Junko, many may wonder why she so easily agreed to do this. However, she was used to following the rules and staying out of trouble. She had seen the results good behavior would get her. Perhaps she believed she was saving her family and eventually could do the same for herself if she kept doing what she was told. From the moment of entering the Ayazi house, Junko's life would become an increasing living hell. When Nobuharu's parents were around, she was forced to pretend to be his girlfriend. This act was dropped with time when the boys realized Nobuharu's parents were not going to report them, either from fear of their son, retaliation from the Yakuza, or backlash from the community. Regardless of their reasoning, and even though they spent a lot of time at work, they had to know what was going on under their own roof. Junko was being gang raped and beaten daily, not only by the 4 boys but also by friends they would invite over to see her. She was starved, forced to eat cockroaches, and drink her own urine as well as others, while they laughed. She was forced to degrade herself by stripping for strangers and masturbating in front of them, as well as being forced to have foreign objects inserted into her private parts. Over time, these objects would run the gamut from fireworks being set off in her ears, mouth, and private parts, to a lit light bulb in the latter. As the rapes and torture continued through the beginning of December, however, she must have eventually lost hope. One night, while everyone was asleep, Junko called police. She was discovered by Hiroshi and made to hang up before she could speak. The police called back, and Hiroshi told them it was an accidental call and not to worry. Junko's defiance enraged the boys, and her torture amplified. She was severely beaten countless times, her face held against the concrete ground and jumped on. She was tied up and used as a punching bag until internal damage made blood come out of her mouth. Dumbbells were repeatedly dropped on her stomach, and she would vomit every time she tried to drink water that her stomach could no longer accept. Flammable liquid was poured over her legs and feet, and she was lit on fire. Reportedly, she went into convulsions, and the boys thought she was faking it, so they lit her on fire again. She also had multiple Oronoman C bottles inserted rectally, causing severe internal bleeding. These bottles would be found at her autopsy. During Junko's captivity, it is said that she was raped somewhere around 400 times. DNA for at least 30 individuals was found either on or inside of her when her body was found. It's further been reported that somewhere around 100 people knew she was being held captive in the Ayazi house, but failed to report the crime and possibly even took part in the sexual assaults and torture. Among these accomplices, very few would ever be arrested. 2 who later would be are Tetsuo Nakamura and Koichi Aihara, who were charged after their DNA was found with Junko's body. The 2 reportedly went to visit the boys at Nobuharu's house, and according to Koichi Aihara, he was bullied into raping Junko. After the 2 boys left the house, Aihara told his brother about the incident, who told their parents, who called the police. This would be December 11th, 1988, when 2 officers were dispatched to Nobuharu Minato's residence with the report of a girl being held captive there. Upon arriving, the officers were told by Nobuharu's parents that no girl was there. They invited the officers to look around, but the officers declined, believing the invite alone was proof enough of innocence. Both officers would later face considerable backlash, as Junko could have been rescued alive at this time. She had been there for 16 days. This would be the second call of something happening at the Minato's residence. The first was less than 2 weeks before, when Junko had placed an emergency call from that house herself. The officers were later fired for failing to follow procedure. Eventually, throughout the beatings and torture, Junko would lose control of her bladder and bowels and soil the carpets, for which she would be beaten again. She was forced to dance and sing while being beaten, and when she would pass out, the boys would dunk her head under water so she would regain consciousness and they could continue to torture her. She was forced to sleep on the balcony at night in the middle of winter, and so it continued for 40 days. Beaten with bamboo sticks, golf clubs, and rods, they cracked her fingernails, burned her with cigarettes, and smashed her hands with weights. Various foreign objects were continually inserted into her, such as cigarettes, grilling skewers, and scissors, causing bleeding. Her clitoris was burned with a lighter, she was stabbed with sewing needles in the chest area, and the boys destroyed her left nipple with pliers. She was unable to eat, drink, or urinate properly by this time, and due to the severity of her injuries, it would reportedly take her an hour to crawl downstairs to the bathroom. Junko no longer even resembled the pretty girl she once was. The beatings had greatly altered her appearance. Her cheeks were swollen as high as her nose, and her burned and infected skin produced a bodily fluid with a bad smell that made the boys lose sexual interest in her. Her eardrums were severely damaged, and due to malnutrition, dehydration, and torture, her brain had reduced in size. She begged her captors multiple times to kill her and get it over with, but they refused. To fulfill their sexual desires, the boys abducted and raped a young woman around 2:30 a.m. on December 27th. She was on her way home from work, as Junko had been, when they pushed her into Hiroshi's car, threatened her with a knife, took her to a motel room, and gang raped her. On January 4th, Hiroshi had been out gambling and lost a lot of money playing mahjong before deciding to return to the Ayazi house. He couldn't seem to get himself settled down over his losses, so he decided to take his frustrations out on Junko. Out of apparent boredom, the others followed suit. At this point, Junko was barely hanging on to life. They kicked and punched her and beat her mutilated body with an iron barbell. Junko bled from the nose and mouth, and bloody pus oozed from her burns. Blood spattered all over the room from the beating. Yasushi didn't want blood on his hands, so he taped plastic bags around his hands and wrists before punching Junko further. The others did the same. They placed 2 short candles on her eyes, the hot wax burning her. She was struck in the thighs repeatedly with a heavy iron ball from Nobuharu's kickboxing exercise machine. It was then dropped onto her stomach several times. They made her stand and struck her face with swinging kicks. She fell into a stereo and began convulsing. Once again, the boys thought she was faking it, so they doused her with lighter fluid and struck a match. Reports say Junko made a few futile attempts to put out the fire before becoming unresponsive. The beating lasted 2 hours before the boys taped her ankles together so she couldn't escape and left to go to the sauna. Junko is believed to have died sometime after they left. The following day, January 5th, Nobuharu's brother called the boys to tell them Junko appeared dead. The boys returned to Nobuharu's house, where they wrapped Junko's body in 2 blankets, pushed it into a large travel bag, and wrapped tape around it. Hiroshi borrowed a cement mixer and truck from a former employer and took them to his house. They brought Junko's body to Hiroshi's driveway, placed it in a neighborhood trash bin, which was a 55-gallon oil drum, threw in some concrete blocks, and filled up the drum with fresh cement. They loaded the drum into the truck around 8 p.m. with plans to drop it into the sea, but on the way they passed an empty space near a development site in Kodo, a spot where people often dumped large home appliances and trash and just abandoned it there. It would be almost 3 weeks later police would arrest Hiroshi Miyano and Jo Ogura for the abduction and rape of the 19-year-old girl they took when they had lost sexual interest in Junko. Then on March 29th, police from the Ayazi district, where Nobuharu's house was located, would come to interrogate them as they had found women's underwear at their addresses and suspected them of theft as well. They split the 2 men in separate rooms, and during the interrogation, one officer decided he would try to dig for information on a murder of a mother and her 7-year-old son, which happened 9 days before Junko was abducted and is unsolved to this day. The officer says to Hiroshi, "You mustn't kill someone, you know?" Hiroshi, thinking Jo Ogura had admitted to killing Junko in the other room, replies with, "I am sorry that we killed." The officer was shocked as Hiroshi went on to explain where they could find the body. They went to the empty lot as described in the confession and found a drum with a foul smell. It took a crane to load the 672-pound drum onto a truck and take it to the police station the following day. In it, they found Junko's badly decomposed body, as she had been dead for over 2 months. Her body was so disfigured from the beatings and malnutrition, she had to be identified by fingerprints. On April 1st, Jo Ogura was arrested for another sexual assault and rearrested for murder. The arrests of Nobuharu Miyano, his brother, and Yasushi Watanabe came soon after. Junko Furuta was laid to rest on April 2nd. She was surrounded by her family and many visibly distraught schoolgirls. The following day, she would have started her new job if she hadn't been murdered. The company she was to work for presented her parents with the uniform she would have worn. It was placed in her coffin. A classmate of Junko's gave a memorial address saying, "Jun-chan, welcome back. I have never dreamed that we would see you again in this way. You must have been in so much pain, so much suffering. The hoppy we all made for the school festival looked really good on you. We will never forget you. I have heard the headmaster has presented you with a graduation certificate, so we graduated together, all of us. Jun-chan, there is no more pain, no more suffering. Please rest in peace." Despite the grotesque and shocking crime the four boys committed against Junko, they were considered juvenile at the time of the crime and their identities withheld. The Shukan Bunshin magazine discovered their names and stated that due to the severity of the crime, the four brutes did not deserve to have their right to anonymity upheld. The four pled guilty to committing bodily injury resulting in death rather than murder. Their sentences were light, and there was a public outcry. Apparently, the boys still weren't happy with their minuscule sentences and decided to appeal them. On July 12, 1991, the Tokyo High Court judge, Ryuji Unazi, overturned the original convictions and sentenced the boys to the following. Hiroshi Miyano's sentence was raised from 17 years to 20 years. He was denied for parole in 2004 but released in 2009. He changed his name to Hiroshi Yakuyama. To this day, he's known to be outspoken about his role in Junko's murder, displaying a playful and triumphant attitude. He's also known for his high-end lifestyle, wearing expensive clothes and driving expensive cars while entertaining friends at various venues. He has a tendency to brag about his ties to organized crime and multi-level marketing schemes. In January 2013, a mere 4 years after his release, he was again arrested for suspected fraud. However, he must have learned an expensive lesson, because this time he kept his mouth shut and due to insufficient evidence, he was released. He's allegedly living a good life and a regular patron at a kickboxing gym. His mother eventually sold their family home and gave Junko's parents $425,000 USD. Jo Ogura was sentenced to an indefinite 5 to 10 year term. He spent 8 years in juvenile court before being released in August of 1999. It was revealed in court that Joe's father had started saving money to send to Junko's parents, despite their refusal to accept it. However, Joe squandered it away entirely on frivolous luxuries. He's also said to boast about his part in Junko's kidnapping, rape, and torture, despite changing his name to Jo Kamisaku. He married and later divorced a Chinese woman and became close to the Yakuza again. In May 2004, at the age of 31, he was arrested for the attack, abduction, and imprisonment of a man he believed to have involvement with his girlfriend. 27-year-old Takatoshi Izano was tracked down by Joe, beaten, and shoved into Joe's truck, where he was taken to a bar and beaten for 4 hours. Joe repeatedly threatened to kill Izano, saying he had killed before and knew how to get away with murder. For this crime, Jo Kamisaku was sentenced to 4 years and once again walked free in 2009. Nobuharu Minato received a 4 to 6 year sentence originally before Judge Yanazi changed it to 5 to 9 years. Upon release, he changed his name to Shinji Minato, moved in with Mommy, and hasn't worked a day since. He married a Romanian or Liechtenstein woman in 2006 and had a daughter. His wife later left him and gained custody of their child. In August 2018, a 45-year-old Minato was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of a 32-year-old man who he allegedly beat with a police baton and slashed his throat with a knife. The victim narrowly escaped and called police. Charges are still pending in Minato's most recent case. Minato's brother and parents were never arrested for any involvement in Junko's case. Junko's parents filed a civil suit against Minato's parents, since their home is where the crimes happened, and won. Yasushi Watanabe is the only one to not yet reoffend. He was originally sentenced to 3 to 4 years, but ultimately given a 5 to 7 year sentence. There has been no other news on his life, and he has not been known to work since his release. All 4 perpetrators were protected by special circumstances for individuals 18 and younger. However, many thought it was their Yakuza connections that helped with their light sentences. They seemed to continually get special provisions, even as grown men, despite their reoccurring brushes with the legal system. Even now, it is difficult to find current pictures or articles on their reoffenses, which is odd considering they were part of such a highly covered case. It stated in court documents that all 4, quote, showed deep remorse and pledged to become better members of society in the future, end quote. That's difficult to believe when 3 of the 4 not only still brag about their roles in Junko's murder, but have also reoffended since their release. Nothing more can be found on Junko Furuta's family or how they've fared since the loss of their daughter. However, it has been reported that after the trials, Junko's mother had a mental breakdown requiring psychiatric treatment. It's truly no wonder. The loss of a child, much less that brutal of a loss, would be beyond heart-wrenching for a parent to endure. The protection of minor offenders is understandable, but at what point do their crimes become heinous enough that they no longer deserve to hide behind anonymity? Surely the grotesque nature of the torture Junko Furuta suffered would file this case in one of the more severe categories imaginable. If the crimes are offensive and shocking enough to make adults' jaws drop, shouldn't special provisions go out the window and alert be given to the public of who these dangerous perpetrators are, regardless of their age? I realize Japan has a different legal system than we do. However, whether the 4 boys were allowed to remain anonymous throughout their case or given new identities when they were released, what really changed? Nothing. You can call a snake a kitten all day, but that doesn't change the venom within it. I think as much can be seen with the reoffenses of 3 out of 4 perpetrators. As with many of these cases, Junko Furuta was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, yet how she suffered for it. Judge Ryuji Yanazi stated Junko was, quote, murdered so brutally at the young age of 17, the victim's soul must be wandering in torment, end quote. We pray that's not the case for pretty Junko, and hope her soul, her family, and her friends have finally found some peace.